Hello, my name's Noel. I'm a psychotherapist. Thanks for joining me. Want to do a short video today on trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, these types of things that you may have heard about, you may even be experiencing or come across in somebody that you love. Sort of the first bit of the video is going to look at some of the tools that I use or that we use as professionals to think about whether somebody has trauma symptoms and whether they can respond to the various treatments. And I'll describe some of the treatments, not in great depth because it's not really about that. And then I'll go on to what the video is really about, which is just talking about sort of my experience as a clinician of meeting people with trauma, what's going on for them, and how I set about trying to help them. So that's going to be the order of the video. I'll jump into it. What is trauma? Trauma is, on a physical, physiological, psychological sense, it's overwhelming stress responses within the body, overwhelming fear, if you like. We can all experience stress or fear or anxiety about things that are real in the world. You know, in the UK at the moment, a lot of young people have just gone through quite stressful experience of doing exams, for example. That's not going to cause trauma mostly. There may be one or two that it causes trauma in because of other circumstances that those young people are in. But the exams themselves will produce stress and anxiety and fear, but it won't produce trauma symptoms, and it's not traumatic in the clinical sense. What makes something traumatic in the clinical sense is that the system that is the individual, this complex system of interrelated working bits of mind, body, relationship, networks of people and support, etc. That thing that makes us up as a human being. Trauma is when that is overwhelmed, that system is overwhelmed and it can't cope. So it can't process the stress and anxiety of an experience. And it maintains living with that as though that stressful experience or series of experiences are continuing. And the odd thing about it for the person experiencing that is that they may not really understand that that's what's happening to them, that they are continuing to live in a previously overwhelming experience of fear, anxiety or stress. So that's what's going on. What do we look for as clinicians? I said I'd sort of just run through some things. So I'll put these resources on the website so you don't need to worry about them, but here's a tool that we use, sort of a threat system to explain what's going on in somebody that's activated in somebody. The threat systems that have racing thoughts, panic attacks, difficulties breathing, pounding, pulse, etc., bladder weakness, stiffening of the muscles. There's a whole bunch of physiological systems. Again, don't try and remember this stuff. I'll put a picture of this on the website for you. So those types of symptoms, those signs that the body is in distress, afraid of something bad happening, are fairly prototypical amongst people. The other things we use are, I use things like this life events checklist and the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist. Again, I'll put these on the website so you can have a look at them. But, you know, you ask questions like, are you having intrusive or disturbing memories of a stressful experience from the past, and you rate it, and how bad has that been over the past month? And it's from 1, not at all, to 5, extremely bad. Obviously, the higher the score, the more disturbing, the more we think that post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms are present and that you need treatment. The thing about sort of many overwhelming or stressful experiences is that we are set up to process them naturally over a period of a couple of weeks. So you may witness or experience something that's overwhelmingly stressful, but after a couple of weeks, the intrusive thoughts, the nightmares about it, the flashbacks, i.e. you reliving the experience, they tend to taper off. And those are all sort of ways that the body is dealing with the situation and getting through it and processing it. So as a professional, I don't really advise that you get people to talk over and over and over again about something within the first couple of weeks. You sort of let people naturally process it and deal with it in their own time. But then there are some other symptoms, and many people know those types of symptoms. There are other symptoms of what might be post-traumatic stress disorder that are maybe not so common. This one, feeling numb or being cut off. So it makes sense if you think about it. When we are overwhelmed with feelings of fear, anxiety and stress, it makes absolute sense that the body would find some way of shutting down so that you don't feel that overwhelm. Because in that state of overwhelm, it's impossible to function. Okay, literally is impossible to function. So this numbing and disassociation, these types of things start to happen as a way of coping with long-term stress and long-term fear and long-term overwhelm, as a way of giving you some sort of coping mechanism. Obviously, that coping mechanism in terms of your relationships to other people can be quite difficult, in that you feel cut off, unable to love people, unable to feel genuinely connected, and maybe distanced from people. And it makes the relationships to other people very difficult, and can lead to all sorts of problems in terms of people trying to deal with that numbing out feeling by cutting themselves or hurting themselves, or maybe trying to manage it through drink and drugs, etc. So long term it has sort of some quite significant and serious consequences, although initially it comes up as a way of trying to defend against being overwhelmed and frozen and sort of rigid with terror. Other things that you may or may not be aware of are things of being super alert, just you hear a noise and you jump out of your skin all the time. And then this one, feeling as though your future will be cut short. We call that foreshortening. And it's not one that's well known, but it's quite a significant one, that people feel that they have no future. So those are a few of the tools that we use to sort of assess whether you have what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, we'll put that on the website and you can have a look at them. I wouldn't advise you to start diagnosing yourself. Go and see a professional like myself to sort of figure out. What produces that then? It's not just stress, as I say, because there's a lot of stresses in life, but we are sort of well designed to deal with it, particularly if we have a good network of people around us. So this thing called resilience, which is a network of people that allows us to deal with stressors. But it typically why post-trauma emerges and how we manage to sort of define it and distinguish it from sort of everyday stress of life is that you'll have these overwhelming stressful either one-off experiences or series of experiences over a period of time, combined with something around death. So you may witness death, or you may be afraid that somebody you love is going to die under certain circumstances, or has died, or you may be afraid for your own life. So it's those two combinations, highly stressful circumstances and situations, and the connection, the association in some way in death. And it gets more complicated with children because their fears and anxieties about losing their parents, the people who care for them, for example, through separation, etc. We think about what's going on in the news at the moment with the separation of children from parents in the US. That's setting, particularly the very young children, setting them up for developing possible post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms later in life, and for having quite significant issues, because for a young child in particular, a stressful separation from a parent can lead the child to think that the parent has died. And that's literally what happens. That's why in the UK, for example, we no longer separate parents and children when children go into hospital. We used to do that, but then we learned from it that it causes these unfortunate post-trauma symptoms in the child. So now we don't do that. We keep them together, and parents are encouraged to stay with their children, help with healing, and to stop these psychological trauma from happening. That combination will lead to this sort of overwhelming anxiety and fear, and some element of death involved will often lead to, if not always lead to, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms emerging. We know a lot about it now. We can very, very much help a lot with these types of symptoms, and we can break the symptoms down. There's, I think, 17 symptoms on the checklist, and we can just work through those symptoms one by one. So essentially what you're doing is getting the individual to get back to a healthy state of being able to regulate experiences. And then just looking at where the disruption has happened in that individual. So we think about things like in the brain and how it's structured, the back brain, the midbrain, the forebrain, and whether they're communicating effectively towards each other. And there are various things you can do to help, such as behavioural changes, cognitive changes, physical exercise can help, teaching people relaxation, mindfulness meditation, cognitive restructuring through CBT. There are very specialised trauma therapy services such as EMDR, which helps with, we think, in terms of processing experience. It mimics something about sleep, healthy sleep, and healthy sleep is a fantastic way of dealing with stress, dealing with experience in life. So teaching people good sleep hygiene, for example, is a great way to help process traumatic experience and get them the brain, the body, and the individual functioning healthily. And why I say the individual, because it trauma, and this is what I want to move on to now, not so much the clinical thing, but the experiential thing, and what I think works really in terms of helping people. The individual, the connected human being, the person who's connected to the world, who needs essentially human relationships to process experience and also regulate emotionally. We are designed for that. Without that sense of connection, without the people around us to actually do that with, we get into a very distressed state as a person. And I think one of the most disturbing things about people's experience that produces trauma is how it cuts them off from human connection. I don't mean just the numbing thing. One of the things I prototypically experience in people, particularly people who may have had childhood experience of trauma, which we then go on to subclassify that into complex post-traumatic stress disorder, i.e. traumatic experiences that have interfered with development, if you like. That's a sort of simple way of thinking about it. In those situations where somebody may have experienced trauma over a developmentally significant part of their life for a long time, have lived with these symptoms for a long time undiagnosed, what you will have is this chronic fear of connection with other people. What our mind tends to do, this is what happens, and one of these things about anxiety and fear, and memory in particular, and how trauma affects memory, is that when we've had some overwhelmingly traumatic experiences that have left us essentially in a fearful state, as though that experience were continuing in the here and now, even though it's not. That's essentially what's going on physiologically, psychologically for us, is that we're carrying forward those traumatic experiences from the past into the here and now, and we're having the symptomology as though we're in the traumatic experience, even though for some people it may have happened decades ago, but they're still living in a way that that they are in that traumatic experience here and now, even if they're not. What that does is it sets up a series of behavioural defences, psychological defences, cognitive defences, which make it very difficult for that individual to connect with other people, open up, share, process, and let go of those traumatic experiences. So they can be very much living in as though, if we think of an example, let's say, for example, somebody had sort of trauma growing up in their family from a parent, for example, who was abusing them in some way, physically threatening them or hitting them, making them feel afraid for their life, and they develop the symptoms that I've described very briefly. Even as an adult, they may be relating in an unaware way, unaware of that they're relating to somebody in front of them here and now in their 30s or 40s or 50s, as though they were still that child experiencing fear of their own death. It's crazy to think of it, but that's literally what's going on. And the types of things that person will tell themselves about their relationships to other people will be stories or scripts developed over a period of time that explain why it is that they feel afraid of everybody. So they will be inventing stories in their head, literally, to explain why this person in front of them is a threat, even though they may not be. As you can see, that's quite problematic if somebody's living in a world in which they experience as a threat, and if you want to help them. And if you come in as a helping professional, or if you come in as a loved one in that person's life, and trying to support that person in getting into helpful relationships that allow them to let go of those experiences and to develop the types of services, the types of support that's needed, so that the experiences can be processed and the person can move on and move into happier and more fulfilling relationships. And that's often what I'm confronted with. I go and visit people, and so do my team. We go and visit people who may be really very extremely isolated because of these symptoms. And I'm talking about people who on the surface are very, very successful. I mean, I work with a lot of very successful people who are essentially very afraid of connection with other human beings. And behind the success, they are often in a lot of distress in their sort of private and personal lives. And that distress is experienced by everybody around them. And they may be very successful in business or work. And like I say, remember, these symptomologies, these things like emotionally numbing, for example, are designed to help you function. They're certainly not designed to help you have a fulfilling, wonderful, loving life, but they are designed to help you function. And people will hold on to those things in the belief that this is what helps me function. You know, this is how I function. This is who I am. After a certain period of time, these types of defences become almost part of your personality. It's very difficult to understand that they can change, because they just feel very much part of oneself. So very much what I do, what my team does, what my service does, is reach out to people who, again, maybe seem very successful but are actually struggling quite a lot in terms of having a lot of these symptoms that I'm talking about. So anxiety and depression, disconnection, numbing, intrusive thoughts, suicidal ideation, a feeling like the future there is no future, etc. These types of really uncomfortable experiences, and then the sort of coping mechanisms that might typically develop around that, the use of drugs, the use of drink, etc., to try and manage them, so that although the person may seem very successful, actually in their private life, it's quite a train wreck that's going on. And for me, you know, my philosophy is that you have to form really, really loving and compassionate relationships that help that person to begin the courageous journey of moving on from that state of being into a state of being where they can experience the world not as a threat, but as a place that is mostly benign and actually quite often very loving and supportive. And that is sort of the process that I really feel works with people. All the other specific technologies of therapy, if you like, are there to facilitate that process, because it's my belief and the philosophy of my company, if you like, that we will use these interventions as a way of helping you as an individual, you as a family, to move on into better relationships with yourself, better relationships with the world, where you feel that you have meaningful, loving, whole, supportive, caring connections with the people around you and with yourself, so that you've moved away from, you know, this fear-based relationship to one in which you can embrace people around you, you can embrace yourself and embrace the opportunities in life. And really, for me, that's the point of all of this. It's not just to be symptom-free, but it's to be supported into defining a life that you embrace as a genuine expression of who you are as a decent, compassionate, loving person in the world. So I hope that explains. I mean, there's a lot of information there, and maybe the video is a bit long. I'll probably get told off for making it a bit too long. But I was just sort of touched by sort of seeing or hearing this stuff about children crying and people having big arguments about policy. For me, it's not about policy as such. I understand that, politically governments may feel they have to do certain things, but I think as a professional, it's important that I sort of make a statement about these things from my own perspective. That I often see people who have lived with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder for many, many years that emerge when they were very young. And it's complex, it's chronic, it's difficult to work with. It's possible to work with it. But I would, genuinely prefer to see that the preventable trauma, such as what we're seeing at the moment, was prevented. And I think it's important on me ethically to sort of comment on that. And also, I think ethically to tell you something very clear, which is this stuff is very treatable. If you're struggling with it, if you know somebody who's struggling with it, do reach out and get in touch. I'm sure that we could help. You can call 07506 319 745 or email info@noelmcdermott.net. Thanks for joining me. I hope this has been useful. Please do leave commentary underneath the video on the website. It is an attempt to do something that's helpful. I'd like to know whether it was helpful or it's not helpful, or any ideas you have for other videos and other resources that might be useful. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.